I'm down to pour. Interesting. Good evening and welcome to Zion's Banner. I'm going to go to our fill-in screen and fill you in on a few things, just for those that follow along. First of all, I probably will be going back to doing some of the programming through OBS, having Restream. It'll also give me some control over the quality here. I'm seeing Minicam cannot alter certain factors that will allow for a better performance on YouTube. And so I want to go ahead and do that, the key stream frequency and certain other things. The other thing is I have a new computer, praise God, through a series of circumstances that will probably increase the quality of what you see and will be able to function better. So those are a few little things on the side. Um, One of the individuals who is part of our community said that they would very much like an update. And so I want to give you a little bit of an update. Things are beginning to loosen up here COVID wise in Arizona. We've had a little bit of trouble with some things around the topic we're going to discuss tonight, as far as certain parts of downtown Phoenix getting a little bit hot. And so I have not had the opportunity to do much outside of evangelism, but not only are things a little socially hot here in Phoenix, but they're also temperature-wise hot with temperatures around 107 until the monsoons start. And so I've not had much chance to get outdoor witnessing. I am doing teaching weekly. You guys know about that. And I'm also going to be on Ministry to Muslims, which does a different guest apologist each week and goes throughout the time. And so this Sunday is my teaching time on Ring, and so I'll be doing that. Also, Chosen People Ministries has encouraged us to really touch base with our Chosen People supporters during this critical time, and I'm thrilled to go ahead and do that, pray with them, and see how they're doing. And so if I don't see you online, there are some folks that I haven't had much contact with, and so that's something else that I'm doing. So that's a little bit of an update. Ministry is a little different right now. Beyond that, a big shout out. I still have a way to go and things can still go wrong, but chapter 3, which is the last chapter, has been provisionally okayed for my dissertation. If that okay remains, then I can go ahead and try to have my editor help me compile the dissertation and then go ahead and um, go through orals. So that's taken some time, and I'm really excited. Shout out to Radical Love. Also, real praise. My wife's home. She's been visiting our new grandbaby, and so I'm really excited about that. And so she is back home, and I have missed her, and so it is good to have her back home. Our crazy Ashkenazi Kvetch Hound, that's our dog, that's a little Yiddish humor, is thrilled to have Marlene back home too. And she is beginning to actually eat food. So we were terribly worried about her. Yes, I know. Pets are pets and people are people, but we've been given charge of this part of God's creation. And so I feel a little strongly that we should do our best by the creature that God made that we've decided to take on. She's a rescue, and we could just consider this part of loving God's creation. And so we're kind of happy that she is happy to have my wife home too. And so that proves that who knows the way God ended up creating parts of his creation that I didn't even think were aware of certain things. Let's get started with tonight. I'm going to do a little explaining with tonight because this is the topic that I may even do a follow up show on, and I never thought I would do. And so I'm going to go to the PowerPoint. I have not been anxious to speak out related to the issue of race. The events that have happened have been truly tragic. I consider the injustice towards any human being to be a great crime. And things have gone on that ought not have gone on. And there's a lot of hurt and there's a lot of anger. But I've had a hard time following the conversation, and it's led me to question, can we go to the Bible and even begin to understand this issue from a biblical point of view? And so I'm not going to comment on what should happen to officers or shouldn't or any of that. I'm not a government official. I have no power. I'm not a court official. I cannot try a case. What I can say is the Bible really does give us a way to begin to grasp some principles around these issues. That's my concern. I've said it well. I'm a biblicist. I want to understand God's view of the world and then apply it. Now, tonight is not going to solve all of that. There are people who have written about what are called racial relations. I'm going to tell you why, because the term race is being used in two different ways by a lot of people at the same time. And they have written whole theology books on it. I want to just start at the beginning and see what we can learn about the way God views humankind. As far as how does God view the distinctions in humankind? We know there are distinctions in humankind. There are different people groups, there are different language groups. I just want to begin to investigate how these things are looked at in the Bible. So if people come on and they view this, this is not Jeff Cran's uh, be and end all on relations between different people groups. This is an examination of if we were to create a theology related to race, how would we even begin and is it possible? Uh, and so that's what I want to do. I just want to get back to the Bible and see if there's some general things we can learn. And so that's this. What I may want to look at is the different moral systems and the riots. And I'm really thinking about doing a show on the riots and a biblical view of morality. In other words, looking at um, why certain world views don't really address or give us an answer to the sorts of things we're seeing, and why a biblical worldview would. And so I'm considering that. These times have taken me somewhat by surprise. And to be honest, while things like this have happened, the veracity in which these things have happened has shocked me a little bit. Uh, Not because I don't think men are sinners, but because I thought there was enough of a Judeo Christian worldview left in our society that some of this would be mitigated. So let's talk about whether we could even begin or where we'd even begin to come up with a theology of race. And I subtitled this A Jewish Follower of Messiah Looks at This Important Issue. Now, I know Dr. Brown has commented on this, but I think he's commented in a way that I probably that is different from me. And I want to really just kind of contrast things. Now, I want to comment on the term race because the term race has been popularized. One of the things I did this week was to view an old movie called Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. I'm not saying I get my theology from Hollywood. but I found it a fascinating movie given when it was done. And how did this term race even come to be? How did it get popularized? We're doing so much talking about race. These lives matter and these lives don't matter, or maybe they matter a little, or some lives matter occasionally, or unborn lives matter, or unborn lives don't matter, or Chinese lives matter, or Chinese lives don't. I mean, how did this whole thing get there? And so I want to make the claim, and we're going to look at a Darwinistic concept of race for just a little bit. Now, what I stuck here, and I really hope you can see it, and I may shrink me down and make this bigger because I really want you to see Darwin's book here. Or I might not because it may not be possible, but I'm going to see if I can shrink myself way down and make Darwin's book way large. Okay, there we are. And you should see that in a minute. Now, you need to see the title of Darwin's original work. You will not see this in most places. When Darwin's book is talked about, you don't get to see the subtitle for his work. And I want you to see that subtitle because I think it's very revealing as to how race got popularized. Let me read it to you. You are familiar with the idea of the origin of the species by means of natural selection, right? We've all heard of that. But here's the subtitle that you need to hear tonight. Okay, the subtitle is The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Did you catch that? That's Darwin's original book. The subtitle is The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. So I would argue that while the term existed, the term race as we know it and understand it today has been influenced greatly by Darwinism. And I think that's going to be part of the problem. And I'm going to make a contention that the way the Bible looks at distinctions in humankind is different than the way the biblical worldview looks at distinctions among humankind. And we're going to take a look at how God looks at these distinctions. So let me click here, okay? The idea of race did pre-exist Darwin, but Darwinistic evolution created a very different picture of race and the unity of humankind. And I think it has ramifications. Um, and so there's a comment in there that I'm going to want to go back and read because someone's sharing something. Uh, And so I'm going to want to read about that encounter because that's an interesting encounter. I'm going to bring up what I think is the best way to do an infographic. Now, I didn't make these infographics available. Usually I make them available ahead of time, and I think I'll make them available after the fact because I wasn't quite sure how well they were going to come out on the screen. But you should be able to see those in a minute. There it is. What we have under Darwinism is some sort of pre-human creature. Remember that Darwinism, things evolve from other things. And then you have the evolutionary process. And so I included that as another brick. And then you have humankind. And then under humankind, you have three basic subspecies. And although Darwin doesn't use this term, um, that's the sort of term I'm going to use because that's really the way they're looked at in Darwinism. Now, I use the term black, white, and oriental. Now, Darwin doesn't use those terms. We're going to talk about old terms for the divisions among mankind. Um, but if we were to look at race today, we would have to look at basically, say, black, white issues as two different subspecies. Now, remember Darwin's subtitle, The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Survival. And then basically the Oriental. The way it used to be done in taxonomy in the 1700s or 1790s is the way you would terminize this, and you're going to be horrified. You had the Mongoloid, and it says an outdated historical grouping of people indigenous to East Asia, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, North Asia, Polynesia, and the Americans. one of the traditional three races introduced in 1780 by members of the Goethean school of history, the other two groups being Caucasoid and Negroid. Now, I'm not making this stuff up. Now, remember when Darwin's book comes out, this is still pretty much probably the prevalent thinking. So we would say, I use the term Oriental, but that's really not very specific. The old term in 1780s was Mongoloid, and no one uses that term anymore because it's considered insulting. But in the 1780s, that was the exact term that someone would use. Um, and so then you had which race? The Caucasoid. Now, before you dismiss this, every time I fill out an application, and I deeply resent it actually, and I don't like it, I'm asked whether I'm Caucasian. Now, if you wonder where the word Caucasian comes from, it comes from Caucasoid or Europid. It's an outdated group, historically regarded as a biological taxon, okay? Which, depending on which historic classifications are used, including ancient and modern populations, it would include Europe, Western Asia, Central Asia. You see, you got a lot of different groups here, okay? But basically, it's connected with Europe. Now, understand with the Black Hebrew Israelites, their argument is that a Caucasoid person cannot be an Israelite. And so that would be the sort of reasoning that they would use. Now, the term Negroid uh, is a term. It used to be used in the 1790s. I'm not making this stuff up. Um, and there was a time when the term Negro was used. It's probably not the popular term right now, but you know, it used to be used. And why did it used to be used? Because it came from this historic grouping. Okay. Um, Now they point out that the group that usually used it were the non-group that was Negroid. Well, that's kind of obvious. Okay. Niger comes from the word dark or black. It has an origin. And so that's where that term came from. And if you looked at Darwinistic taxonomy as far as human beings, this is the sort of thing you would see. Every time I fill out a stupid form for our government, I see groupings that really are not necessarily the groupings that the Bible would use as far as peoples and groups and distinctions in humankind. And by the way, I'm going to say that some of that grouping is political. Okay? I'm not saying other people groups don't exist, but our government tends to do this to gather stats around certain agenda. Okay? Now, nowadays, we use different things. You ever filled out a form and you have this thing, okay? And you have new race categories, American Indian, Alaskan Native, Asian, Black, African American, Native Hawaiian, and other Pacific Islanders, and white. Now, we're going to look at the biblical distinctions that God gives for humankind, but those aren't an accurate reflection of much of anything from a point of view that God would probably take. And so, what I'm going to argue is that God does acknowledge distinction in humankind, and how he does it, we can learn something from. And we could take some principles away from and actually get something out of. And we're also going to learn, why some of these distinctions exist and don't exist as far as the biblical worldview. Um, these taxonomy categories that the government uses and Darwin uses, they still reflect the old Darwinistic thinking, okay? Which regards different groupings of people as subspecies of the humankind. Okay? Now, the government does admit that the third category, placement Hispanic, which, by the way, is not the favorite term for people who are Hispanic, okay, because my daughter spent time around that culture in South America, and they would not necessarily like the term Hispanic at all. Hispaniola was Spain, and it's actually a very colonialistic term because Spain settled a lot of those territories, and the Spanish ended up intermingling to some extent with the native Aztec and Mayan and what we would call pre-Columbian or those type of people groups. And so Hispania is Spain. And so when we say that somebody is Hispanic, we're actually saying that they're Spanish. Uh, Latino, Latina, Latinx are more the way those groups would identify themselves. Understand that when you're filling out a form and you're filling this out, you're fulfilling a political agenda and you're fulfilling thinking that is still characterized by a Darwinistic influence. These groups are being ranked according to physical feature alone, and pretty much some pretty standard physical features that center around skin tone and maybe a few other facial features. Okay? And so I want to kind of get that out there. Now, the way the Darwinistic model works, remember, this is the preservation, okay, uh, the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. The way Darwin views this is all species are competing for resources. The strong survive and the weak die, and that's the way it should be, because then the strong pass on their superior genetic traits, while the weak dying off cleans out the gene pool and actually makes the creature become a better creature in some way. And so under the Darwinistic model, and these are the implications, you just got to live with these implications. These are the implications of the Darwinistic model. All right? Since some species of human beings are competing for the same resources, it is assumed that some subspecies will end up demonstrating themselves to be superior to others, the exact same way in the animal kingdom as stronger species of a particular animal survive and the others die. That's why the subtitle, The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. What Darwinism is essentially saying is that the strong races or subspecies of humankind will succeed in garnering more resources and propagating, and they will survive, and then the others ought to just die off. And I think that has real implications for racism. In other words, I would argue that Darwinism perpetuates and exacerbates racism. If there is racism, Darwinism perpetuates it. So for a Darwinist to complain about racism is an oxymoron. It actually is contrary to the worldview they're espousing. I'm going to make people mad, but that's the way it is. Okay? There's no reason to think that racism is incorrect under the Darwinistic model. It's simply a matter of race most fit for survive. Discrimination by the strong against the weak is perfectly acceptable and part of what we'd expect from the evolutionary process. And understand, and this has been pointed out, that Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, was interested in getting rid of poverty by getting rid of the lower class. And she was going to limit the lower class by making sure no more of them were born. That was her solution. She was not some great heroine at all. She's being painted that way for ideological purposes, but really, she was actually very Darwinistic about this whole thing, and so she had her way of cleansing the gene pool. Now, I want to contrast that with the biblical model of the unity of man, and then we'll look at some of the biblical terms that God uses to talk about distinctions within humankind that he does recognize. Genesis 1:26, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, let them have dominion over the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over the earth, over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. The biblical picture, I'm not the only one. Ken Ham wrote something called One Blood, in which he talks about this very dichotomy, the difference between the evolutionary worldview and how it affects the way we look at distinctions within humankind, and the Darwinistic worldview. And the biblical worldview is that humankind is essentially the same creature. In other words, from the biblical model, here's what the Christian should say: there's only one race, the human race. Everything else we'll look at. There are distinctions within the human race, but as far as human race, all human beings are equally image bearers of God, regardless of facial features or phenotype. And that's the biblical model. So we're not talking about subspecies of human beings battling over each other to get resources, in which the strong subspecies of human beings are perfectly allowed to overcome the weaker species of human beings, subjugate them or use them as they please in order to propagate themselves because they are indeed superior. Do understand that Darwinism has implications that are absolutely dreadful. Um, I have problems with a theory that purports to be true while being morally reprehensible. In other words, if something is true, it should be morally true as well as true in every other sense. In other words, truth coheres with itself. And so I have a bit of a problem with that. That is the biblical picture of humankind. Now, Paul reiterates this biblical picture. I'm going to give you some background on Athens that you may not know. Why does Paul say he made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth and has determined their pre-appointed times and boundaries of their dwellings? Now, he's giving this to a bunch of Athenian philosophers. You have to understand Mars Hill. These folks are highly educated, abstract, logical thinking pagans. Now, the Athenian philosophers began to leave Greek mythology and began to talk about the Logos, and some of them even postulated one divine being. Some of them were more pantheistic and thought that the universe was God. But Aristotle actually put forth the idea of a prime mover, a prime creator, but they never reached the place where the Hebrews were, because God revealed himself to the Hebrews to reveal himself through them to the world. And so Paul gets on and he says, he made from one blood. Now that's the unity of humankind, every nation to dwell on the face of the earth, and has predetermined their pre-appointed times and boundaries. In other words, God has made every type or grouping of human being, distinction from human being, from one human couple. And there's a unity of the human race. And he's reaffirming the Genesis account. So you don't have any questions here. Paul was perfectly in line talking to these Greek philosophers with the Genesis account. Why would he mention to the Athenians that we came from one blood? Why is that a big deal talking to an Athenian audience? Well, here's the fascinating thing. There's information to indicate the Athenians believed that they sprang from the earth at that location. In other words, they had a distinctly separate origin from the rest of humankind. Now, how much the Athenians believe this, I don't know. But the idea was around, and Paul counters the idea of the Athenians that they are somehow a separate creature that is human or sprang with a separate origin by talking about how he, God, made all of humankind. Athenians, you think you're something special. You think you came from the earth. You think you have a separate origin. You think you're better. No, you are just a section of humankind. And so Paul emphasizes the unity because the unity must be emphasized. Okay? So I pulled up a picture of the biblical model. Now, this may be a little hard to see because the biblical model is more complex, and so I had to use more boxes. So I'm going to try to bring me down. I must decrease so this picture can increase. Ooh, that sounds almost biblical, right? And I'm going to pull this out as far as I can. Okay? And under Under OBS, I'll be able to blank myself out and make the picture just the picture. But Minicam is not going to let me do that tonight. Okay, and so I'm shrinking that down. And under the biblical model, of course, at the top you have Adam and Eve, right? That's our first couple. That's where human beings come from. That's the biblical model. Then you have the Tower of Babel. Now, the Tower of Babel is very important, okay? Because from one human being, you had the Tower of Babel. Now, you had Noah in between, and you had Noah's 3 sons. And the Creation Museum has done a good job with that, and so has the Ark. All right? From Noah's 3 sons, everyone's together. Now, I have some charts, but they're not pictures, and so I was very leery of showing them because I don't know what Noah's sons looked like. And so I don't want to go ahead and pretend like I was there. And Ken Ham doesn't know what they look like, but what he did is he indicated that one of Noah's sons might have been a little fairer. One of Noah's sons would have been darker, Ham, and then one of Noah's sons would have been very Mideastern looking and middle tone skin. All right, and that's what he did, and he's trying to show that the combination of Noah contained the genetic variance to allow for all the skin tones and features that we see now. All right. Now, when Noah's sons get off the bar, mankind is still in a sort of unity, but the Tower of Babel occurred. From the Tower of Babel, you had the dispersion of humankind. Now, remember that within the human being is the genetic variance for all the features that we see today. Human beings adapted so that certain genetic features became predominant and others became non-predominant. Now, here's the interesting thing with Jewish people. All right? If you look at a Sabra and a Eastern European Jew ends up going back to the land and intermarrying the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic, you get a Mideastern looking person all over again. In other words, what happens is the two parts of the Jewish people brought together creates what used to be, which means the genetic information is still sort of there. Okay? And so from the Tower of Babel, you have adaptation and you have the development of different language groups resulting in different peoples, okay, that end up spreading out. And the variance in melanin is a reaction to the climate conditions that a post-flood world offered a dispersed human population. All right? So that's what ends up happening. That's a biblical worldview in a nutshell. It's not perfect, but it gives you an idea. Now, there are some distinctions between the biblical worldview and the Darwinistic worldview. Okay? The implications of the biblical worldview are very plain. All human beings are fully and equally human with no intrinsic superiority or inferiority to any group. In other words, those of my brothers and sisters who may end up having a higher level of melanin and certain other features are just as human and just as much image bearers as I am, and I am just as much an image bearer as they are. Okay, now that's very important. That means that we all have exactly the same worth from a divine perspective. Okay? All human beings are fully image bearers, but Darwin doesn't think so. Darwin's thing was the struggle of favored races. Some races are favored and some are simply non-favored. From a biblical perspective, all human beings are favored by being image bearers. In other words, the basis of human dignity does not lie with origins, it lies with the image of God in man. That's a very important distinction. Under Darwinism, it is survival of the fittest. Under the biblical worldview, it is the equal dignity of all people. Now, whether that's being played out correctly or not, that's not the issue. The issue is these are the implications of the biblical worldview. If we're going to develop a theology of race, we have to start at the beginning and we have to look at how distinctions in humankind occurred. Because otherwise we can't begin to understand the issues involved. So We begin at the very beginning because that's a good place to start. All right. And we look at the implications of the two models. All right. And so we start with the origin of humankind in general and then look at the words that convey race or serve the same function. In other words, we start with human beings. We acknowledge that differences occurred as people were dispersed and language was changed, so there were distinct language groups at the Tower of Babel. And then we look at what terms does God use to talk about distinctions within humankind. This is a very important thing to do. So, are there terms where God actually recognizes some sort of distinction between humankind? Now, I'm not including gender distinctions tonight. Male and female are common to almost every people group. Okay, we are intrinsically binary gender wise. Okay, that could be an entire other show. But we're going to assume that people from China come in male and female. People who are Polish come in male and female. We're going to go ahead and just kind of skip that in terms of other distinguishing terminology. So let's look at some distinguishing terminology. Genos is one of the terms used in Greek consistently to indicate a distinction within humankind. Okay? If you're wondering, we have the term genus. Actually, it's borrowed probably from genos. It refers to kind, race, family, birth, offspring. It refers to a person or group of people that are bound together by familiar ties or common sort of ancestry. So the focus is genetic pregeneration, a group of people that share progenitors, begetters, okay? A group of people that share begetters in some way, okay? So we could talk about a Jewish kind. We share begetters. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the begetters of the Jewish people. And we could talk about that. A common ancestor, okay? Descendants of a common ancestor. Okay, and that's where you get genos. So God talks about extended descendants of common ancestors. It's one of the ways he recognizes a distinction, is that certain individuals come into being through a chain from a common ancestor. Okay, extended family generationally over a broad spreading out. Okay. And so it's used of Israel in Philippians 3:5. Okay, where Paul talks about being an Israelite. These people are defined as belonging to a particular nation. Mark 7:26 identifies a woman as a Sepho-Phoenician woman by birth, genos. Okay, she was organically Sepho-Phoenician. All right, it's one of the terms God uses. Sarx is used, or sarkos, flesh. Now, flesh is used a lot of different ways in the New Testament. It can refer to our sinful nature, fleshly behavior, carnal behavior, but it can also talk about human nature or earthly descent, especially when kata is used with it. If kata is used with sarx or sarkos, it often means earthly descent, according to the flesh. Paul uses that. He says, who are Israelites according to the flesh, or my countrymen according to the flesh. Kata sarx. Okay? And he's talking about that. And that refers again to the procreative process. My countrymen who are, who share the same earthly descent. Can be used according to the same flesh, the same descent, the same procreation. Phule is a little different. It's the word that we translate tribe. Okay? Anna was a prophetess from the tribe Phule of Asher. It's a subgroup of a nation. It can be regarded as more closely tied than the entire nation. The Asherites were all descended from Asher, but they were a smaller group than the Israelites, who were all descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's a subgrouping. Phule is used, um, or phulace is used. So that's another grouping that God uses in the Greek to indicate differentiations between humankind. Glossalia, sorry, glossa, it's a word we get glossary from. It means tongue. It refers to language or dialect. If I say I speak the Hebrew tongue, okay, it's the language of. It's a use that God uses, all right? And so it can indicate a differentiation according to humankind by language. Now remember, we're talking the Tower of Babel. That's when the great dispersion of humankind occurs. And then those subgroupings of human beings end up sharing the same progenitors, because remember that when Tower of Babel came, it says they were separated by language according to their family and according to their kin. So when God changed their language, he did so in such a way that family units or extended family units would share the same uh, alteration or tongue. And so as those units spread out from Babel, they have common progenitors. All right? Laos, people, population, community. Um, there's an excellent article, The Population of a City, in Genesis 19:4 in the Septuagint. Laos, members of a tribe, the Laos of Judah, like those of Shechem, who intermarry so that they become one people. Hasta, Enai, Laon, Hene. All right? They became one people with the Israelites, the inhabitants of a country, an indigenous population. Uh, Religious distinctions, in the sense that the term Laos is used in terms with the people of God to refer to the Israelites. Okay? And so that's sometimes used as a phrase to differentiate the unique position that Israel was placed in. Ethnos. Now, this is a very important one. Don't miss this. This is in the Great Commission. Go ye into all the nations. It's not nations. I keep loving to point this out to Christians. It's ethnic groups. When I look at the Great Commission, it doesn't say go into all the nations. It says go into all the ethnic groups. That's literally what God is saying in the Great Commission. We're not to go into all the nations. We're to go into all the ethnic groups. I will argue for ethnic ministry. I'm a believer in ethnic ministry. Why am I involved with Jewish missions? Because the Jewish people are an ethnos. We're an ethnic group. All right? And so ethnos. Sometimes it's used to translate the Hebrew word Gentile or goyim, and it can have the negative population connotation of heathen in the terms of the ethnic groups that don't know God or didn't have God. All right. Now on Hebrew side, you have the term Am. It means people. When I was growing up, we used to sing about Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live. Am, people. The emphasis is on internal ethnic solidarity with Am, and it's a Hebrew term. Goy is used. It simply means nation. There is at least one place where Israel is called Goy, a nation, by the way. Isn't that interesting? Um, and so that's kind of interesting. Geographic ties or cultural ties or extended ties. Now I'm going to. It's not you guys, believe me. I'm going to ask an important question. Let's look at these terms again. How many of these terms differentiated people by skin tone, facial feature, or bone structure? In other words, which Greek term specifically pointed out skin tone? None of them. Which of these terms pointed out facial features? Well, never directly, did they? The flat nose in Greek, or the round nose in Greek, or the long nose in Greek? None of those are differentiations for people groups. Do you realize that? That's a terribly important thing, because when God looks at the distinctions between humankind, the emphasis of his accepting or acknowledging those distinctions is not based on outward appearance. Isn't that kind of fascinating? I mean, when we make distinctions of race, aren't they generally based on phenotype and physical distinction? I mean, that seems to be the way that works. Yet when God uses terminology for the distinction between humankind, the emphasis seems to be not on the outward. Okay? A survey of the terms of the divisions of humankind would indicate to me that God seems far more interested in kinship, language, and custom. In other words, God's far more interested in the expression of man's image. The expression of God's image through what man does, how man lives, and how man expresses himself. Culture are the artifacts of man's expression of the image of God. Language is the means by which man expresses himself. And so God seems more interested in the expression of his image in different ways than he is about the outward appearance of the individuals doing the expression. And I found that terribly interesting, because we are exactly the other way. We're far more interested in how people look or don't look than we are in the expression. Okay? And so that really struck me. The way we approach this issue by looking at biblical principles and basic biblical concepts related to nomenclature is at the issue as a starting point. I think too many people get knee jerk. I've seen way too much knee jerk. I've seen knee jerk both ways. All right. I've seen dear brothers and sisters that are bending over backwards to apologize for their skin tone, for their European ancestry. They feel that they have some burden that they have to bear, and I disagree. From a God-given standpoint, I don't necessarily think that's true. I'm not looking for the pharaohs of Egypt to reimburse my people for labor given. And so there are some that are bending over backwards to do that. Okay. Then there are some people that are angry. Um, but they're angry at everybody who doesn't look at them indiscriminately. It's not about whether certain individuals have discriminated, or even whether certain segments of society, they're just angry generally at anybody who doesn't share their tone. Okay? I've seen these knee-jerk reactions, and I'm terribly concerned. Um, and so that's one of the things that is a concern. And I think from God's point of view, these knee-jerk reactions are not going to be helpful. They may even create division in the church that is not necessary. And so I am concerned about that. God is not concerned about precise skin tones as much as we are. He does seem to attach importance to peoples. And I think that's interesting. Do we look at peoples as peoples? Now, let me tell you what offends me. Do you honestly believe that a Southern Spaniard is the exact same people group as a Northern Swede? Do we honestly believe that? I find that an offensive concept. That a Celtic person who is Irish is the same people group as a Teutonic person who is German. Now, notice the terminology I'm using, Teutonic. Refers to a large swath of common people groups with probably common ancestry outside of Noah. If I talk about Teutonic people and Celtic people and Slavic people, the Slavs and the Teutonic people did not like each other. The worst thing that a German in World War II, when they lost, could fall into were the hands of the Russians. They would rather give themselves up to the Americans because the Teutonic people and the Slavic people did not get along. But they're both marked as Caucasian on the government forms. Do you honestly believe that a South American views himself, now my daughter could testify this, do you think a Chilean person views himself the same as a Mexican person does? Not if you talk to the Mexican person, they don't. Do you honestly believe that a Chinese and a Korean person culturally view themselves as being the exact same people group? This is offensive. Um, Polynesians don't view themselves necessarily as Chinese. Um, People from Mongolia don't necessarily view themselves as Chinese. There were some battles over that one. Um, and I don't think God does either. I think he views them both of image bearers from different people groups whose cultures can be redeemed so that they can express Christ in unique and special ways that neither group could express Christ alone. I remember Randy Elkhorn saying one of the reasons for having all the different people groups in the world is because Jesus Christ cannot be fully expressed by any one people group. He is so incredible that it's like a symphony, and you need all the instruments in the symphony in order to have the song play right. And I thought that was a beautiful sentiment. I deeply appreciate distinctions. And so, no, I don't put my Teutonic person in the same category as somebody with a beautiful Scottish or Irish lilt and say, well, you know, you're obviously Caucasoid, aren't you? I find that offensive. And I don't like those forms. God's emphasis on kinship is very significant to me because it shows the importance that God places on family and the family unit. If you're going to have common progenitors, you have to have families for the progeneration to occur. God puts a lot of those terms under the emphasis of generation and procreation. So, the unity of humankind is the answer to racism. What must be emphasized is the unique and special unity of humankind. And I'm going to say this, I don't know how many people I'm going to offend. Racism cuts both ways. In other words, in my mind, black racism is no more acceptable than white racism is, because both deny the image of God in the other person. Okay? When the news media reports racism, it generally uses it in one direction. And that's not a good narrative. There are historic reasons for that, but it's still wrong. It's an inappropriate use of that term. It cuts both ways. And all human beings are equally image bearers. So that is not our primary consideration to analyze someone's worth by their skin tone. Darwinistic thinking has done more to create race relation problems or problems between people of lighter skin and people of darker skin, as well as ethnic groups. In other words, Darwinism is the gasoline on the fire that burns. People already have the hatred. Darwinism basically gives them a worldview in which that hatred is accessible, whether they want to admit it or not. But in their hearts, if there can be a superior and an inferior race, then I simply have to decide my race is the superior one, right? And if you don't think this played into anything, understand that the eugenics that Hitler proposed were based on Nietzsche and Darwinism. And so, one of the questions I asked my Jewish father, we're having some real struggles as I try to share with him, and he doesn't much like some of the things. He kind of thinks that God should really answer to him. I think that's a little backwards myself for a lot of reasons. But essentially, when you look at this whole thing, um, I can honestly, I once said to him, "You're a Darwinist. I want to know why you're following a Nazi theory." Because the Nazis ended up basing their eugenics and their master race on Nietzscheism and Darwinism. So why would you accept a theory that is essentially a theory of origins that is essentially Nazistic? Um, let's just say that I've got to be a little careful, but it's pretty intense. And he's 91. I've been hoping to try and ensure we have some good conversations, but we have some real woo-woos lately. And so that's the way that is. Darwinistic thinking is horrible. You will never get rid of racism as long as you're operating under a Darwinistic frame point. Okay? Now, I want to go back through because there were some comments up there, and there was at least one exchange that I hadn't even heard of. So I want to find out more about this exchange because I'm totally fascinated, especially if it deals with Ravi Zacharias, who has done some incredible stuff. Um, and of course, he has gone home to be with the Lord. We've lost two really incredible apologists, at least this year. One is Ravi Zacharias, and the other is Nabil Qureshi. And I think Nabil Qureshi was actually last year, but they're pretty close. And I want to get back to this exchange. Um, so I'm just going up through here real quick. Okay. Okay, I don't know about, oh, Richard Dawkins and Ravi Zacharias. Richard Dawkins was asked what the full title of the book was by an Anglican priest, and he was so flustered that he asked God to help him to remember it. That's a great anecdote. It's very frustrating because it shows what Darwinism really is and what it's really worth. And so I did not solve all of our problems. I did not, thank you. Someone corrected. Man, has that much time passed? Nabil Qureshi died in 2017. 2 years? I am like really floored. Wow. I am totally floored. Okay, it's been longer than I thought. Um, um, this didn't solve everything. This told you that, yeah, I believe we can come up with a theology of race. I think we start with Genesis. I think we look at the distinctions that God acknowledges in humankind. And I think those are good places for us to start. Um, I'm really considering the next topic because I really think it's inconsistent to have moral outrage in a materialistic, deterministic system to begin with. And so I'm thinking about taking that up. Um, but that's where things are. I'm glad to give you the update. I do want to go ahead. First of all, shout out to my man, Steve. I haven't been, he hasn't been one of the people I've called. By the way, I would be glad to pray and call any of you guys if it would be a real honor. Um, so, um, and so I don't want to take anything away from that. You are community. Um, and so I just want to give the shout out. You guys are all great. I always feel bad because I always feel like I'm leaving someone out. But I'm not intending to leave anyone out. Radical Love, it was great to see you. Nate, it is always good to see your blue wrench up there. doing that moderation for me. And I'm glad I am giving you a real hard job yet. But that's absolutely great. Uh, uh, Gerard, we had Brother Brian there. This is just beginning to delve into where you'd even start. There's some great names going up, and I'm going to get some water for my voice, and I will be meeting folks for a Nosh of Hebrew tomorrow, and I hope to have the computer switched over. It actually has a video card and faster processing, and it's going to let me do what I do better. It's a godsend, and but I got to get all the software transferred, so we'll eventually get there. Um, so, um, and I don't think we'll have a lot of questions tonight. Um, but if you have any questions that I haven't answered and you don't want to throw them up there, Patreon is a good way to do it. And I've thrown some research, resources people way and answered some questions, and I'm going to stick up there. If you don't know about the ring teaching that that George Saig is doing, tomorrow night, if you're here, I'll throw up the links for that. I encourage you, Ministry to Muslims is great. They have cool guys other than me. I don't always listen to other people because I'm doing this a lot, and sometimes it's nice to spend some time with family. But there's the email address. Feel free to get in touch with me. Um, God bless you all this evening. It is wonderful to have had you here. Hopefully, it either cemented things, added to things, or just gave you stuff to think about, which I love to do. Hey, by the way, we're over 300 viewers. So we've broken the 300 mark and gone past it, 302. May God continue to allow this stuff to be useful to people. Okay, please do ask the question tomorrow if you have it, and I will be willing and ready and waiting excitedly for your question. If you don't get it in, there's email, but I'd encourage you even to ask it next week, because other people may want to hear the answer to your question. Your question may be not just your question. Your question may be more than your question. So. Oh, 303. Okay. Okay. I just saw Nate's post. So he is on top of it.